to Dem Bahamians. Dem Bahamians is a media initiative of the Bahamian American Cultural Society. Today my guest is going to be Dr. Grace Turner. Dr. Grace Turner is an anthropologist and archaeologist in the Bahamas. So we're going to go via Skype to the Bahamas to have a conversation with Dr. Turner. Dr. Turner has done extensive research on a burial site in the Bahamas where a lot of our free and slave ancestors are buried. And for a number of years, this, I think even up to today, this grave has not been designated. There isn't a plaque there that tells us, who's buried there. And so we want to bring focus and attention to this very important site, and also to find out from Dr. Turner if there are other such sites around town that have not yet been recognized, and hope that we can bring some recognition to these kind of sites that are around New York, Nassau, and the Family Islands. I should say very important sites. So, Dr. Turner, welcome to Dem Bahamians.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Okay, so Dr. Turner, just to begin the conversation, just here last week, I think it was August 9th, we celebrated Emancipation Day.
Foxhill Day.
Call it Foxhill Day. Okay, can you explain and give us some enlighten us to what Foxhill Day is all about?
Okay. So,
give us a historical and archaeological as well as a cultural component to the day.
Okay, so the first Monday in August has been designated as a public holiday celebrating and commemorating the emancipation from slavery in the Bahamas as a part of the British Empire in the Bahamas. And it's been a public holiday in the Bahamas since at least the mid-19th century. There's the distinction between August Monday, as it had traditionally come to be known in the Bahamas. August Monday is the first Monday in August, as distinct from Foxhill Day, that is usually about August 9th, because Foxhill traditionally was a community, I guess a rural community, a separate village from the town of Nassau, and they had a considerable African-descended population, slave and free, and they got the news about emancipation like about a week late, and so Foxhill is still a distinct community today on New Providence, and so they like to keep that distinction. It helps them to maintain their identity as a separate historical community in the Bahamas. So for New Providence, you would have Emancipation Day or August Monday, the first Monday in August, and this year it happened to be the 5th because August started in the middle of the previous week, and so the 9th kind of came up less than a week later, but that's why you have those differences there.
I see. Okay, so trying to get a grip or enlighten myself as to what Emancipation Day is all about, I decided to go to the web, and last night I saw where one of the members of Parliament, the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Immigration, Fred Mitchell, he gave a presentation to a group in Foxhill about Emancipation Day. Actually, it was the history about Foxhill.
Yeah.
And to any of my viewers who like to tune in, it's the videotape, and you can download his presentation on his website. It's called BahamisUncensored.com, and you'll find his presentation to the group. But one of the things that struck me, he was able to identify the first Bahamian, or the first person to go into the Fox Hill area, was a Samuel Fox, around 1801. Do you have any information on him, Grace?
Not specifically, but Samuel Fox would have been white, unless the document specifically said, because for that time period, if you weren't white, it would be specified in the document. They would either call you a person of color or black. A person of color would suggest that you had mixed ancestry. Black would mean that even if you had mixed ancestry, it was definitely predominantly African. So unless the documents describe Samuel Fox as a person of color or free black, the general assumption is he would have been white. But there was a community in that area, the Creek Village, from early in the 18th century. So Fox Hill, Sandlands Village, they are separate and distinct areas. New Providence, in terms of topography, New Providence has you would call it a coastal ridge, a line of hills, closer to the north coast. And because in front of that, Nassau is between that ridge and the harbor, and Fox Hill Village is pretty much on top of that hill and over to the south side.
I see.
Creek Village, from what we could determine, Creek Village is probably would have been more on the north side of that, but there was a community in that area for pretty much of the 18th century. So it would, it's not as if Samuel Fox was the first person living in that area. But communities in that area were more scattered and dispersed. We know that there were people there, and because of the demographics, most of them would always have been black, free, and enslaved.
I see. Okay, that's great. Now, let me ask you, now we're going to be talking about this burial site, which is further downtown, closer to...
It's a cemetery. It's on the eastern edge of Nassau.
Right. Okay. Now saying that, Fox Hill was predominantly where a lot of black folks live. Do they have a similar burial site in the Fox Hill area, similar to the one we're going to be talking about downtown?
No, for the time period that this cemetery site is, because this cemetery site would have been established sometime in the first half of the 18th century. That would have served as a public burial area for blacks and free people of color for much of the 18th century into the 19th. It wasn't closed until the early 20th century, but at least in its first 100 years of use, that cemetery would have served as a burial ground for communities all along the eastern shore. That would include Creek area, Fox Hill, because the eastern side of New Providence, the communities were smaller, more scattered, more dispersed compared to the area on the western side of Nassau. A free black community developed just south of Nassau. That was there from the 18th century, and much further on the western end of the island, there were a couple of plantations. A few of those plantations actually predated the Loyalist period. Those were rare, but the settlement patterns were slightly different on the east side of Nassau than they were on the west side of Nassau.
I see. So folks, say the Adelaide area where a lot of slaves live, or
Adelaide was established as a community for African captives that the Royal Navy had freed from slave ships after the slave trade was abolished.
I see.
Adelaide it's known in our documents as the Liberated African settlement. Adelaide, Carmichael, Gambia. Those were established especially for African captives. These were Africans who were captured, kidnapped, bought, sold, whatever, in West Africa, put on slave ships illegally after 1807. And if the British Navy intercepted them further on this side of the Atlantic, the Bahamas was one of the premier areas where they would have been landed. And these liberated African settlements were, that was I'm struggling for the word, but that was a means of solving what do you do with these people, because to send them all the way back to Africa, that was, technically it was possible, but that would have been close to another 2-month trip, and the ones who would have survived, a lot of them would have been in poor condition. Many of them wouldn't have survived a round trip back.
I see. So now, now is there a burial site similar to the one we're going to be talking about later on in the Western District that took care of those people when they passed on?
The contemporary cemetery site for the western side of Nassau that would be sort of contemporary with this eastern one is not, it isn't far out. It's now on what's known as Meeting Street. It's next to St. John's Baptist Church. It's on the top of the hill. It's at the junction of Meeting Street and Augusta Street, and its historical name in the records was Bethlehem. That's not quite a quarter of a mile further west up the hill from the White Cemetery on the western side of Nassau. And that one was established in the late 18th century when the Loyalists came in and were reconfiguring the town to their likes and preferences. But the archaeological research that I did indicated that the one on the eastern end of town is much earlier than the Loyalist period. But these cemetery sites, a number of them were dedicated by the Bishop of Jamaica, the Anglican Bishop of Jamaica, because the Bahamas was in his diocese. They were dedicated in 1824, and the documents say that these cemetery sites, these two, well, not two, there's the ones especially for people of African descent and the white sections. And the documents specifically say that by the time they were consecrated, they had been in use for at least 30 years. So it puts them into the late 1700s. But the research on the one for the eastern side of Nassau shows that it's much earlier than that.
Okay, so now is that grave, recognized? Is there a plaque that says, who's buried there? And is it used today?
No, it's not used today. There is no plaque as yet identifying the site. And from the records that exist, we probably may not be able to identify specific individuals who had been buried there, but we know from records it looks as if the cemetery was in use until at least the first decade of the 20th century, and after that it appears to have been out of use because it was fairly small.
I see.
So after, by that time, it had been in use for like 150 years or more by that time. So it probably was pretty full by then.
I see. Okay. So let's talk about this site that you have, excavated and did your extensive research on here, that is situated on the eastern part of the island, just at the foot of the entrance to the Paradise Island Bridge.
The foot of the new one. There are now two bridges. It's the foot of the new bridge.
Right, the new bridge. Tell us about your. First of all, let me ask you. Let's talk about your interest in archaeology. When did you first become interested in this kind of work?
Yeah, well, when I came back, after I did my initial run through college and graduate school, in graduate school I had originally pursued cultural anthropology. My undergraduate degree was in history, but I encountered anthropology, cultural anthropology, and cultural anthropology to me was writing books on stuff my mother and grandmother talked about. It was scholarly treatment of Bahamian folk culture, predominantly African Bahamian folk culture. And I grew up in a family where I had access to my grandmother's, grandaunt's. I had access to an older generation that remembered a time and a way of life very different than I knew as a child. And so when I encountered that in an academic setting, it naturally piqued my interest because it was already familiar to me. But when I came back home, there was little understanding and appreciation of what you do with that kind of stuff. That's like talking people business they don't really have to tell you about. But there was a move at the time to develop an interest among Bahamians in archaeology so that there could eventually be a government body that could monitor, oversee, and promote archaeology within the Bahamas. And so I came home at a time when I could get in on that. And I'm normally an outdoorsy person, except if I run into spiders. And so, my interest in history, Bahamian culture, outdoor stuff, exploring, I was able to get in on that. So to me, archaeology is really history in 3D.
Right, yeah. And of course today, there is that, burning desire to know more, especially seeing that I'm sure when I went to school and when you went to school, our history of Bahamian history was not a part of the history book. So today we are really trying to catch up with with who we are, which is very important today.
Critical.
Yes, and very critical. Now, let me ask you, this burial site, is it? How did you first come to know of this area? Because there seemed not to be any demarcation. It's just an open space there. I can recall growing up, this was our beach. This was our beach. We would come out here to the waterfront, and my mom will take her beach chair and sit out and watch us swim and have fun in the water. So, but there was no demarcation that there was that was a burial site. So when did it come to your attention or to somebody's attention that was a burial site for free and black slaves?
Well, we didn't see. In my former life, I also worked in the Department of Archives, and being in the Department of Archives, one of the researchers at the time, he was an Anglican priest, Father Irvin Maxvini. He was doing research for the Anglican Church on the role of the Anglican Church in education, because the Anglican Church had always been a premier institution in the education, particularly of black children, before emancipation, and it became critical after emancipation as well. And that's when we learned that some of the early records for the Anglican Church in the Bahamas aren't held in the archives in the Bahamas. They're in Jamaica because until, I think it's until 1860, when the Bahamas became its own diocese, the Bahamas came under the Diocese of Jamaica. The Diocese of Jamaica wasn't formally created until the early 1820s, because the Bishop of Jamaica actually came here to dedicate these cemeteries, and he had only recently been appointed. It had been in the works for some time, but it took a while. Things moved slowly then, and in some ways they really haven't changed now. And so for the early part of the Anglican Church in the Bahamas, to research archival records, you have to go to the National Archives in Jamaica. And Father Max Vini found this document in the archives there about the consecration of these 6 cemetery sections. The parish of St. Matthew's was created in 1792, 1795, in the 1790s. It was one of those created because the Loyalists came and they brought, it was a population boost. Up to that point, Nassau, New Providence, only had the one parish, and that was the parish of Christ Church. With the expansion of the population, there needed to be at least one new parish created on New Providence, and that was St. Matthew's in the 1790s on the eastern half of the island. And so one of the cemetery sections created would have been the immediate churchyard around St. Matthew's Church. And the presumption there is to be in that section, you have to be high status and presumably white.
I see. That's a graveyard around St. Matthew's Church.
Yeah, that still exists now. Also, there was a second section that was created around St. Matthew's. That was the Eastern Cemetery. That still is the Eastern Cemetery now. That was a public cemetery. And then, so that's already 2 sections. Then there was Center Burial Ground. On Center Burial Ground, it's the pie-shaped piece. It's between Dowsville Street and East Bay Street now. That is the eastern edge of the Eastern Parade.
Right.
The Eastern Parade was already there. Center Burial Ground was there. Center Burial Ground is now the earliest surviving cemetery on New Providence, because the Cemetery for Christ Church Cathedral was destroyed in the early 20th century in stuff. So Center Burial Ground was dedicated, upgraded and dedicated. The presumption there is that was probably for high status white people as well. And then the 4th section was on the waterfront, and the title for that was specifically St. Matthew's Northern Burial Ground for Blacks and Free Persons of Color.
Okay.
That is the cemetery site I was looking into, because it's on the waterfront.
Okay. Now, by this time, are they registering people, who die or in that area, or can you identify any names of people who are buried in this particular free and black slave burial site?
Well, the problem there in identifying burials is that for this time period, the only records that exist would be the burial records from St. Matthew's Church. If they were buried from St. Matthew's Church, the priest would keep a record who was buried, and the burial register, whites would be listed in the front of the book, and at the back of the book they would have blacks and free persons of color. And I found for the Bahamas, we were not quite like the U.S., where there was this strict segregated color line. For the Bahamas, there was you had racial segregation, but it was more relaxed than it was in the U.S. If you were a black person that had the right social and economic status and connections, you were socially recognized as white. Because there are a few cases. It's not very common, but you can find them. So the assumption then is these people who would have been buried in the cemetery, some of them were free, some of them would have been enslaved, but these would have been the poorer ones. There is no guarantee that all of them would have been buried there, because as I mentioned before in our discussion about Fox Hill and Creek settlement, settlements along the eastern coast were more spread out. You could find individual houses. Several years ago, BEC and excavating along the eastern road, they came across an individual burial not far from Fort Montague. We determined that that was historic burial and not some more modern murder victim, because the person didn't have 20th century dental care. So just because there was no cultural material to more definitively date this burial, and for human remains that are only a couple hundred years old, you cannot chemically date them. You have to have cultural material. So for this cemetery, it's difficult to identify individuals buried in that cemetery.
I see. Okay. Now, let me ask you now, you did an excavation of this gravesite.
Yes.
What was the purpose of, excavating this area? What were you looking for? What were you trying to achieve?
Okay. Well, for archaeologists, normally, in the last 20, 30 years since in the discipline of archaeology, particularly in North America, has been forced to become more sensitized in the way you treat burials, because I'm kind of an exception, but especially for North America, and the same would be true for Europe, most archaeologists, over 90% of archaeologists, would have a European heritage background. They wouldn't be Native American or predominantly African descent. And because Native peoples and people in the African diaspora have historically been so socially disadvantaged, there are some sensitivities, let's say, in how current communities would see the treatment of their past by white archaeologists, and that those issues have forced the discipline of archaeology to become more sensitive about, especially how you deal with burials, because even though the people are dead and gone, they're not going to talk back. Oh, their descendants and the descendant communities, oh, they're very verbal. And so because of that, archaeologists tend to not choose to excavate cemetery sites unless that they want to gather information, unless that site is under threat for development or erosion, unless you're under threat of losing the archaeological resource altogether. Without excavation, archaeologists, regardless of your cultural or heritage or background, tend to stay away from that. For this site, because there has been so little research done for the Bahamas, this site, it's not really on the water's edge now because there's some reclaimed land in between, but because New Providence is a very prominent tourist development, and it is an island, it is a small island, so the pressure and the balance in balancing historical heritage and modern development that's a very delicate balance. And this site was really under threat of destruction from further development.
Wow.
And its history wasn't clearly known and understood, and before it was too late, I chose to do archaeological investigation of the site to show and prove that even though this is an old site and there might be a general public understanding that little or nothing of this old cemetery remains, I wanted to show archaeologically that that isn't so, and also this would allow an opportunity to investigate a site that was set aside specifically for people of African descent, to see how African people treated their cemetery areas differently than people of European heritage, because they do come from different cultural backgrounds, and you cannot simply assume that because these people were African and brought in at the lowest status, you cannot simply assume that they were browbeaten and forced to take on European cultural traditions. Mm-hmm. That process happened over time, and archaeologically you could see that time process playing out. I wanted to be able to see how clearly I could see that in this cemetery site.
Okay. Now, in your excavation, how did you know there was just a plain open space there? Nothing that's had any demarcation as to say Mr. So-and-so is buried here, Mr. So-and-so is buried there. How did you know where to begin digging, to begin your excavation?
Okay, well, to start with, the site is a fairly small site. It always was. It was always pie-shaped. It's long but narrow, and because it was on the water's edge, and so there would be a limitation. And over time, since the cemetery has been closed, over time, East Bay Street has been gradually widened. When they put in the new bridge, they widened it a bit more to give access for cars to move over into the lane, to go over the bridge. All of those gradual widenings of East Bay Street would have cut into the original dimensions of the cemetery. And the most critical thing, it's sometime in the 1930s or 1940s. The records aren't complete, so it's not clear exactly when, but it had to have been sometime in the 30s or 40s, that time period, when a sidewalk was put through this site. And my understanding of why that was done then is that Nassau, the whole North of Nassau was devastated by 2 hurricanes in the late 1920s, and the storm surge washed sand pretty much straight up to Dowsville Street. And it seems the common understanding was that this site, it was on the water's edge, it had been devastated by these hurricanes, and so nothing was left. But archaeologically, that's never so. And so the government at some point in the 30s or the 40s put a sidewalk through the site. And in going through the archaeology, it becomes apparent that they were encountering burials when they were putting in the sidewalk, but that didn't force them to stop. It seems they must have gathered up the bones and what headstones were there and dumped them off site. And so what I would find on the site at this time would be scattered remains. So I'm not finding complete intact burials, and so it becomes even more difficult to know the number of burials in that site, to look at them over time, to have complete skeletal remains. It becomes sketchy, and so at this point I can only make broad statements about burials within the cemetery site. But it was enough to to show that it was a cemetery site, and that should be enough to stop its further destruction.
Okay, but now during the excavation, were you able to find any hardware, jewelry, or buttons, etc., that will probably give you some idea to say, well, that this person was a soldier? So some of, were there any kind of, surprises that you came across?
Well, generally cultural remains. As I had mentioned earlier, unless you find cultural materials with human remains that are like under 500 years old, unless you find cultural remains with them, it's very difficult to understand how old they are. And so, yeah, there were any number of cultural remains in this site, and there'd be a wide range. And as I had mentioned before, I wanted to get an understanding of how different, in what ways would people of African heritage treat their cemetery landscape that would be different than people of European heritage at this time, and could you see any changes? And for those of African heritage, the most prominent cultural treatment you would find would be the placement of personal items. They should have been on top of the grave, but because this site has been disturbed over time, you're not going to see that distinction. But I found evidence of dishes, ceramics, bottles, glass bottles, and a couple of ceramic bottles, glass, a few metal things, a lot of nails. These would have been fairly poor people, and so their coffins would have been simple. The nails would indicate that you were dealing with some hardware that was nailed together, but I didn't find any coffin hardware like handles, because these people at the time they would have been around, they probably couldn't afford the coffins that would have had fancy handles like that. But I did also find some personal items like from clothing, mostly buttons, and one a little filigree gold pin that would be late 1800s, possibly early 1900s, that would have probably come from a woman's dress or blouse top. It would have been at the neck, at the throat, and there was a military style button, one of them that I found in the far eastern end of the site. But the surprise and the puzzle about that button was that it didn't have British symbols on it. It was a British colony. It had the American eagle on it, and so I had to research that style of button and find out when that style button would have been in use and who would have used it, who would have had access to it. That style of button should have been produced for the General Administration Service or General Services Administration. It should have been produced for that agency about 1900, but the research indicates that that style button, they had a lot of them, and so you could find those buttons being sold to people who weren't employed in the General Services Administration. So this individual, probably a man who had that button, who was buried with that button, definitely worked in the U.S. Without further information, you can't say for sure that this individual worked for the General Services Administration. They could have gotten it otherwise, but that's an indication of how Bahamians from the 1870s on would have been moving back and forth between the Bahamas and the U.S. And we lost a significant amount of our population through that migration.
Okay, so Grace, we have some graphics that I'd like for you to, tell us about. Can we have some graphics up, please? This one shows the digging. It shows the grave, a hole with some.
That one, from your description, it shows a unit. Yeah, the technical term in archaeology, the square hole. Right. That's a unit. You control the size of them so that it's easier for you to map and measure where you found things exactly.
Okay.
That one, from my memory, is showing the top of a cranium, a skull.
Right. Uh-huh.
That cranium, and with that cranium beneath it, we found most of the spinal column, most of the vertebrae, a number of ribs. That was the largest cache of bones I found within the site, and that photograph I took to indicate and show how close beneath the base of the earliest sidewalk that was put. Mm-hmm. So my interpretation of that is that these were bones from a burial that had been dug up, and they had gathered them up to dump them, but somehow in oversight, this particular group of bones were not dumped. But when they were smoothing the site for the base of the sidewalk, they were just covered over by about an inch of soil and the sidewalk put on top of that.
Okay, let me ask, can I see the full site of the grave site? No, the greenery and the trees. Yes. Grace is showing the burial site right now.
Yeah, that should be looking northeast. It's looking towards the arc of the new bridge going over the Paradise Island. So that's the site. I'm standing on the edge on the edge near the street, mm-hmm. and it's looking to the northeast.
Yeah,
that is the site in its present form.
So well, today they seem to be taking care of this area, giving it more attention.
Well, it's a grass verge, it's a grass verge. It's in a prominent area. It's right on East Bay Street. It was always a very public area, and it's at the foot of the Paradise Island Bridge that is the entrance to biggest tourist mecca in New Providence. So it's a very prominent site. So it gets care and attention as the grass verge. The delicate balance here is that all of the attention and all of the care won't necessarily be archaeologically sensitive, like when another government agency thought that they would go in and drill holes to put in more bollards, to put in a barricade. If you're drilling into the site, you're disturbing the site even more. So that kind of delicate balance needs to be there. Any digging anywhere in the site now, you are further destroying, further disturbing what archaeological resource remains.
Now, but we have a similar site here in New York City, a burial ground area down in Lower Manhattan near the financial district.
The New York City African burial ground that was originally just outside the wall for Wall Street.
Right. Now that area is enclosed, and it gives you the impression, the feeling of reverence. How can you, bring about that kind of reverence to that area, and so that persons passing wouldn't mind stopping and saying a prayer, or sitting somewhere, having a bench there where you can sit and meditate or pray for the departed.
Well, see, there again, you would in developing some memorial form, you also need to consider what becomes most important, what's most significant. Are you going to be willing to sacrifice more of the site to try and wall it off or protect it from further incursion, or are you going to leave it more open? The site in New York City, that is much bigger. The area that's enclosed, that's the only area that's left. That site is much bigger than that. That was the only area that was left. That had been fully excavated. That's why they could put that area there. The individual burials, because they were studied and analyzed. There are over 400 of them, something like 419, if I'm not correct, but they were reburied within that site, but they were able to fully excavate that site, and so that gave them a bit more leeway in how to create a memorial for the site. For this site that I'm doing, it was already a tumble site from the sidewalk being put in the 20th century, the widening of the road, things like that. You can't recognize individual burials. We don't know how many burials there. It's a very small, limited site. To try and put any sort of barrier, any sort of divider around that now, you're going to be taking away a lot more, losing a lot more. Humans are the most destructive force for any historical site around, because once you put up a barrier, you pique people's curiosity. So for that site, the form of its memorial would really have to be thought out, because as I keep mentioning, it is a very public area, and so you no longer have the option or the ability to shield it from the public eye. You no longer have that option, because you are right on the edge of a very public road. It's a very small site, so if you're taking away to put in walls and fences, you're taking away more of the already small site. So those kinds of issues have to be worked through and played with on how this site is to be memorialized.
So how can you bring attention to that area? Can you do a monument? A little monument, a statue? How can you bring some attention to that area?
Yeah.
What would you suggest?
Well, it won't be only up to me. That we would have to go through discussions with Dr. Tinker and the rest of the staff at the Antiquities and Monuments Corporation. That would have to be worked through. What would be most appropriate and still historically significant for that area? Which part of the site would be least sensitive? Which part of the site are you going to be losing the least amount but still have? That all has to be worked out, and it won't be left up simply to me.
Yeah, just a suggestion, because passing the site, you would think that it's just another nicely, kept yard. Garden.
It's a grass verge for a public street, and because it's like that, it's been maintained. The great irony is that even though that destroyed a lot of the integrity of the site, that has really saved it, because it's still government property. My excavation, I had to go so far to actually prove that there are remnants of human remains there, because we had a challenge from another government agency who wanted to make use of the reclaimed land that's now between that site and the actual water's edge. They wanted, if I only had the remnants of old dishes, bottles, and even nails from coffins, that wasn't enough. They wanted to prove that there had been human remains there. And so the excavation had to also prove that. So other government agencies had to back off. But most Bahamians today wouldn't know that that is anything more than that grass verge, because for most of the 20th century, that's what it was. And Center Burial Ground across the street, Center Burial Ground is exactly across the street. And we know how early that one is because that has legible headstones in there. The Ministry of Works went in and put in, technically it's a beautiful wall, but that beautiful wall destroyed, it didn't destroy, but it damaged some of the earliest gravestones in that cemetery. So you're going to put in your beautiful wall to protect it and make it look pretty for the nice tourists, and you destroying the actual thing you're saying you're preserving in the meantime. There's that balance, and there's a sensitivity in that. You go and you splatting your cement all over the 200-year-old. Yeah, good job on that.
Is there a plaque that tells you, what's there? Is there a plaque that tells you that free and black slaves are in this area?
No.
Is there anything to tell you that? Is there a demarcation?
For the site that I excavated, the Northern Burial Ground, there is no signage there. To date, all that we have now is that site is not to be further disturbed because another government agency had plans to use the reclaimed land beyond, and they thought, oh yeah, an old cemetery was here at once, but there's nothing left, so we could go through, we could destroy it. But that's not going to happen. It's public land. It's not to be developed, but the issue of any signage, any memorial, that still has to be worked on. And then there is the not very subtle and delicate issue of how are you going to pay for all this. All Bahamas government agencies just went through a budget cut this year, and so that impacts anything new you're going to do. How are you going to plan for these things? All of those things also come into play. And even if there is the potential to raise private funds to pay for it, you have to go through the process of getting the permission, deciding what it takes time to get all of that done.
So have you shared your research?
No, it's not going to be destroyed. Pardon me?
Have you shared your research with any of these departments as yet?
This was my dissertation. The dissertation was, I only got the degree granted earlier this year. I'm hoping I could make a book out of it, but if you're wanting for academic works that started originally as dissertations, once that dissertation is out there online, and mine is probably available by now, depending on what it is, it lowers the options for having it published and all that. So
I see.
The dissertation is available, but I'm not sure. At this point, I have to now carefully plan what and how I'm going to share, if I also plan to write a book.
Okay, so as it stands now, it is something that you can publish into a book form.
I'm hoping.
Okay, well, good. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Good. So, Grace, based on your research, are there any? What happened with the Lucayans in San Salvador? The
Lucayans would have been all through the Bahamas, not just San Salvador.
Yeah. Okay, but a large percentage of them were in San Salvador. Is that correct?
No. San Salvador, the current San Salvador in archaeological terms, is the leading candidate to be the historical Guanahani that Columbus landed on the morning of October 12th and renamed San Salvador. That's the only difference that sets San Salvador apart.
Okay.
Other than that, the whole Bahamian archipelago, which includes the Turks and Caicos Islands, was inhabited by Lucayans.
The Lucayans. Is there a special grave site where they all can be,
No. Lucayans in the Bahamas, Lucayans chose to do their burials because these people wouldn't have been European heritage or African heritage, so their burial traditions could be different. In the Bahamas, Lucayans tended to use a lot of caves for burials, and in the last 20 years or so, we've discovered that they also use some blue holes as well. But Lucayans use caves, whether those were dry caves or underwater caves, as burials. That's kind of unusual in the Caribbean because other islands in the Greater Antilles and in the Lesser Antilles, the Taino they would have their burials out in the open. But I think in the Lesser Antilles, the body would be put in a large ceramic vessel and buried. And they would be put in the fetal position quite often. They're not laid out straight like the European tradition. In the Bahamas, what has heavily impacted Lucayan burials in caves is that once Europeans came in and established historical settlements, one of their economic activities was to go in caves and gather bat guano. And that has meant that a lot of Lucayan burials have been lost like that, or at least the burials have been disturbed. They would put aside the bones, so you find the bones, but you don't know their original positioning like that.
Okay, Grace, I want to thank you for being my guest today, and I wish you the very best in finding a publisher for your book. I think it's shared quite a bit of information on our history that's really needed, and I'm really happy that you brought that attention to that burial site where you find free and black slaves there. So thank you very much for being my guest.
Thank you, Tom.